Story 1. My second birthday was memorable. I developed a sense of consciousness while opening a Pinkie Pie baby doll on my mom's lap, surrounded by a circle of people watching me in a gym. All I remember thinking was, "This place is big," as I looked at my baby doll. Story 2. When I was 3, I had to blow my nose in the back seat of my parents' car. My brother told me to use my sock, so I took off my purple sock and blew my nose. He then told me to throw it out the window. After I threw the sock out the window, my brother said, "And that was the legend of the purple sock." Story 3. Not even born, I inherited a genetic memory from my mother when she was in college. My grandfather dropped her off at college with her friends. She didn't believe me until she found a college photo and asked me to describe the people in it, and I got them all exactly right without looking at it. Story 4. 4-year-old me running out of daycare because the teacher suddenly changed my dance partner during rehearsal. Story 5. I was 4, getting overwhelmed in a toddler brawl that I instigated. Our parents encouraged us to be friends, and we still are today. We haven't talked in years, but when we do connect, it feels like nothing has changed. Story 6. My first memory is sitting in a high chair, dead silent, just watching my family argue and already realizing I was the smartest one there. Story 7. I was a baby and don't remember my exact age, but I was old enough to recognize my parents. I wanted nothing to do with anyone else and became fussy when the unfamiliar lady next to my mom came too close to me. She was presumably a nurse. Story 8. I was about 3 or 4 when my parents taught me how to brush my teeth. They didn't clarify what they meant by, "You need to clean your brush before you brush." They intended for me to just run it under water, but I squirted hand soap on it and started scrubbing the brush. They freaked out because they thought I was going to brush my teeth with soap. Story 9. I remember seeing my dad's body in the tomb when I was 5 years old. I didn't understand what was happening as I played around his tomb, but I still recall it very vividly. Story 10. I was about 3 years old when I got run over by a car. It hit me head-on, and I ended up coming out the back near the mufflers. I got a little burned and had a small hole in my foot. I had to learn to walk again and put weight on my feet. There was a lot of pain and crying because my mom wanted to hold me, but the doctor said no, he's walking to you. Years later, I just have a small burn mark that looks like a birthmark on my side. Story 11. I believe I was potty training when I had an accident. I knew my mom would not be happy, so I disposed of the evidence in the toilet and went back to watching Winnie the Pooh. Ironic. Story 12. 1.5 years old, my mother gave my little brother my blanket, and I remember feeling so sad and angry. He had already received my toys and my chair, and now my blanket. Story 13. Funny thing is it was painful. I remember my grandmother feeding me, and I was refusing because it hurt. I found out years later from my mother that I had reflux when I was less than a year old. The doctor said he had never seen a baby react like that before. I ended up with a feeding tube for a while. Story 14. I don't remember much, but my first vague memory is being 12 years old at the coast with my grandma. I don't recall the sequence of events, but I remember getting a pink bikini that I still have. I took a picture with a foreigner who had never seen someone with curls like mine. I also remember sharing my shopping-related issues with her. We heard people making noise on the streets because of football. I don't recall anything from before that, and even afterward, my memories are hazy. Sometimes, I find myself thinking, this place or item used to look bigger. Story 15. I have a couple of vague memories of having my diaper changed. I remember tearing a piece of wallpaper off the wall while standing in my crib. The crib rails were about as high as my mid to lower ribcage. I then pretended the strip of paper was a shopping list and that I was grocery shopping. Finally, I remember being on my dad's shoulders. He was getting me a bottle from a high cupboard, and I wanted the bottle shaped like a panda bear and was telling him so, but he couldn't understand me because I couldn't actually speak yet. He grabbed the plain blue bottle from the cupboard, and I remember feeling really frustrated. It's a surreal memory because I understood everything he was saying, and in my head I was legible, but I could tell by his lack of response that he couldn't understand me. Story 16. 3 years and 2 months. Moving day. I remember walking out the front door of our new house into the sunlight and up the ramp of the moving truck to look for my lost teddy bear. Dad walked me back inside, and we found it. Story 17. I remember my mother made me a cake shaped like a butterfly for my 4th birthday. I also have another memory from when I was about 3, but I don't have a reference to know exactly when it was. Story 18. I can't remember this past period. I've disassociated so much that I can't distinguish between my good and bad memories. Story 19. I kept having my green dream repeatedly when I was 4 or 5. I explained it to my mom many times, until one day she said, "Oh my gosh, you are describing the hospital birthing room and the doctor when you were born." My earliest provable memory is of a house we lived in when I was 2. I described the layout of the house and the view from the front porch to my much older sister once, and she said, "That's impossible, you were 2. Story 20. I was 2 years old when we lived in Hawaii, and I remember sitting in a car seat that my dad had strapped to his bike. He did wheelies while we rode near the beach. My memories begin to clear around the age of 3 when my little sister suddenly appeared. Story 21. Sitting on my grandfather's and father's lap while we drove in a white 1975 Ford pickup. I was in diapers and holding the steering wheel. It was so cool. Story 22. Oh, this is a fun thread. I remember being in my crib, and every time I lay on my right side, it seemed I would hear a fire or police siren. I remember trying to avoid laying on that side, fearing something bad would happen. Holy cow, I think I was less than 2 years old. Damn Generation X. We were just built differently. Story 23. At 3 years old, I used to call my parents by their names and was confused when they laughed at me for doing so. Story 24. My mom told me the reason I couldn't go to an amusement park with my siblings and cousins was that I was too annoying. My uncle, who was in charge of the trip, didn't want to deal with me all day. I think I was 3. To be fair, 3-year-olds are very annoying, and I was probably particularly so. I don't blame my uncle for not wanting to look after a small child, as I was a few years younger than the others. But she didn't have to tell me like that. Some lifelong trauma was unlocked that day. Story 25. My brother pushed me down the stairs when I was 2. I landed in the basement and immediately started crying but then stopped. At least this blanket broke my fall, I thought, and went back to crying. Story 26. Just shy of a year old. I remember walking out the back door and watching as a white pitcher fell off a high shelf. I ran outside where my mom was hanging laundry, and she wanted to know where my grandmother was. There was a big earthquake happening. It's just some moving images, and it's not much, but I remember it. So did my mother. Story 27. The summer of 1977, I was 3.5 years old. I was in a park in Brooklyn. For some reason, I took my shoes off and walked around barefoot. Then I stepped on broken glass. Story 28. My brother's 2nd birthday was a significant event for me. I was 3.5 years old at the time. I remember feeling extremely jealous and heartbroken because he received a beautiful wooden puzzle with a little red knob on each piece. The puzzle was round and primarily red and yellow, with each piece depicting some sort of animal. Red has always been my favorite color, and I thought it was so unfair that he received such a gift. I bet my parents were quite pleased with me that day. I was a challenging child, I'm afraid. Story 29. My father died when I was young. I remember that he was lying back on the hotel bed. I was sitting on his stomach, and we were looking out at the city and skyline. It is my only memory of him, as he passed away shortly after that. My mother says it happened, but there is no way I can remember it because I was barely or had just turned 2. However, it has always been clear in my mind. Story 30. It was my 3rd birthday. I received a black and gold tricycle at my grandma's house. I remember getting it and then, in the street, having my shoelaces caught in the pedals. I am 34 now. Story 31. I was 2 years old. My childhood cat, who was about 3 at the time, escaped through the front door when my older sister, 5, was getting on the bus for kindergarten. I can vaguely remember my hands against the glass screen door, and I remember my sister crying in front of the bus because she didn't want to get on it during the chaos. Then I remember my mom kneeling down next to the deck with a piece of ham, luring the cat out with the sandwich meat. It was a funny memory in hindsight, but it was very stressful for all of us in the moment. Well, except for Jasmine. She got to explore the lawn and enjoyed the ham. I missed that cat. Story 32. I thought it was when my parents moved my sister's cradle into my room, as we are a year and 10 months apart. However, I asked my mother about a pleasant walk we took close to home that I loved. There was a really old tree, and I enjoyed walking around it and climbing up and down its roots while she held my hand. I wondered where she had left my sister during that time because it was just the two of us, and she told me that my sister had not been born yet, so I have memories from when I was a year and a half old. Story 33. 3 years old in San Francisco on vacation. My dad pointed down at the cables in the street, explaining how the trolley cars work. Story 34. I told many people about this memory, and for years they said it was impossible. However, I have a memory of sitting in a sink, holding a box that smelled good. My dad confirmed that memory with an actual picture of that moment when I was just over a year old. He put me there to take the picture, and I grabbed an old-fashioned air freshener, which was that box. I still have that picture to this day. Story 35. Age 2. I stood up in my crib and called to my mother, "I'm ready to get up now," because I really had to go. Her response, of course, was, "It's not time to get up yet." I wet my pajamas, cried, and got in trouble for both. Good times. Story 36. I can't recall if I was 2 or 3, but it was definitely before I began school. I remember wearing white pants with thin black vertical stripes. I was walking around my bedroom and started touching the drawers of a white wardrobe, seeing if I could climb on top of it. It was a brief and faint memory that I can't fully grasp. Story 37. Being reprimanded for hitting large stones with a tennis racket, they went over to the house and struck all our neighbors' cars. Story 38. I remember being bathed in the kitchen sink. I don't know how old I was, but I must have been very young. Story 39. My great-grandmother offered me food I disliked when I was a bit older than 2. I also remember when I got accepted at the daycare and my parents celebrated. I even received a beach ball. Another memory from the daycare is when my younger cousin joined and laid on the floor crying because he wanted to go home. I thought that if I did the same, I would also get to go home, so I joined him, and eventually we both went home and never returned to daycare. I also remember eating Play-Doh thinking it was candy. Story 40. I remember having mucus suctioned out of my nose with one of those squeeze tools when I was probably a newborn. I don't remember it exactly, but I'm sure I'm not far off from how young I was. Story 41. When I was 2, I remember my mom telling me that I would fall off the bed, and the next day I woke up on the ground. Story 42. Getting bitten by a dog, fainting, and missing the birthday party that day wasn't ideal. It wasn't a bad bite, and it was my fault for accidentally stepping on the dog's paw. It was hilarious that I actually slept for as long as I did, but at least my family got me a ring pop. Story 43. I was 1. It was Christmas Day, and I fell down the stairs. I hit every step on the way down. I remember seeing my dad diving across the room, trying to catch me at the bottom. Story 44. I have 3 memories, and I have no idea which one was first. A dog snapped at me when I decided to play horsey. He was not a fan. My dad saved my life when I fell into the pool. Watching another one of our dogs die from a brain aneurysm. I am pretty sure that I was 3 for all of them. Story 45. Watching my oldest and best friend run through our kindergarten halfway naked because he didn't like diapers. Story 46. About 6 months ago, I don't remember the details. Bright light on the water, my hand reaching out, cold water being plunged onto hot wooden panels. Story 47. Less than 2 years old, I walked into a room off the living room to get a copy of Mr. Gilthump for my mom to read to me. Story 48. One of my first memories is of my parents arguing when I was 2. I don't remember the words, just the atmosphere and a glimpse of them yelling, with my older brother looking concerned at me repeatedly. They divorced soon after. I love them both, but together they were incompatible. Story 49. I remember playing with a toy army Jeep, probably a Hot Wheels, at my grandmother's house. I recall telling my aunt that I was 3.5 years old. I am not certain if that was accurate, but that is my earliest memory. Story 50. I was taken away by the police due to a domestic dispute between my parents at that time. I was about 3 or 4 years old, and I remember it to this day. Story 51. I was 3 years old, lying on my pink, ruffled bedspread, kicking my feet and crying because I was having a fit about something. I don't recall what the problem was. Since I grew up in a not-so-happy family, it may be for the best. Story 52. I remember my brother's umbilical cord still being attached and waiting for it to fall off. I was a month shy of turning 2. Story 53. I have 2 answers for this, one sad and one goofy, so I will do both. First memory. I woke up at 3 years old crying over the SpongeBob episode, Due in Time. There's a gag where an old fish writes his entire legacy in red ink, and an exploding prune truck ruins his papers. I remember being so devastated that he was going to die before he could write it. Also at 3, I was led onto a real train and even got to honk the horn. I was not prepared for how loud it was and proceeded to run down the cabin cars. I would have kept going if I hadn't been caught. Story 54. My mom said I was less than 2 when this happened. I remember being in my playpen at my grandma's old house, and it was right next to my sister's dresser. She left her eyeshadow next to the ledge, which was a rookie mistake, and I remember opening it and wiping my finger across it. It was blue. Then I remember wiping my finger across the bottom of my playpen mat. Now here's the part one don't remember. Apparently, I got caught and sat in front of the door because I thought my mom couldn't get in. She could. Story 55. Being at my father's house, I remember walking to the store and being yelled at for jumping on a waterbed. My brother wasn't born yet, as I was between 18 and 24 months old. Story 56. Under 2 years old, I vividly remember crawling next to my mother, who was counting coins on the floor. I picked up a 2-pence coin and immediately attempted to swallow it. It went about as well as you would expect. My mother got the fright of her life as I nearly choked to death, had blue lips, and everything. This incident gave me a lifelong phobia of choking on things. I used to chew all my medication, and I can't be around people who are sucking on boiled sweets or, heaven forbid, throwing food and catching it in their mouths. Just typing that makes my palms sweat. Story 57. I was running around with my brother when I fell on my hand and felt a sharp pain. As I was getting up, my brother fell on me, causing even worse pain. The scene shifts, and the next thing I know, I am with my grandmother. She is wrapping my arm and tells me we are going to the hospital. At the hospital, I remember playing with toys until my dad arrives and tells me there is nothing wrong with my hand since I can still play. He unwrapped my hand, and it was all bruised, with the bones visibly sticking out in a strange way. Thankfully, nothing pierced the skin. He took me to a nurse, and less than an hour later, I was in the operating room. In the operating room, a nurse told me the Sandman was coming to put some sleep dust in my eyes. I responded that I knew the Sandman wasn't real, and that they would inject me with medicine to make me sleepy. All the nurses and doctors laughed at my comment before I went under. I was 2.5 years old. My hand was broken in 3 places, and my elbow was dislocated. I ended up needing 3 surgeries on my hand and was at the hospital on my 3rd birthday that year. The oddest part of it all is that my daughter broke her arm when she was 2 years and 4 months old. What are the odds? She slipped and fell at daycare. Story 58. I was about 4 years old when Dad and my sisters brought home our first puppy, Toddy, a Lagotto Romagnolo. I remember saying, "Wow, is that for me?" Story 59. I was sitting in a high chair while my mom fed me. We were watching Welcome Back, Kotter. Story 60. I was 2 to 3 years old. We were still at the small cabin where they brought me home from the hospital. My mom was tending to the garden while I stood behind her. A teenager from the next block came over and asked if she could watch me for a while. I was absolutely fascinated by her attic bedroom with the sloping ceiling and the fact that she had a television. Story 61. Christmas the year I was 2. I went into the dining room to complain that my cousins were playing with my new toys, while they wouldn't let me play with the Mr. Potato Heads they had just received. I remember the table being way over my head, and I can recall who was sitting where. The whole family was there. The only person I couldn't see was my grandfather, who passed away 6 days later, leaving me with no memories of him. Story 62. I was spending time with my mom, who was ironing. My brother was sliding down the stairs on his bottom, and I was worried about him getting hurt. I was 2 years old, and my brother was 6. Story 63. I was about 3 years old. My sibling and I were playing with our cat. I wanted to pet him, but she kept grabbing him and picking him up, even though he didn't want to be handled. I remember thinking, that's why he's called Jumper. He always jumps away. I would jump away from my sister too. My sister still does not respect the boundaries of those closest to her. Story 64. I have a memory from when I was very young, probably between 1 and 2 years old. I was wearing a red jumpsuit and toddling around the cafe where my mom worked. I turned around to see her leaving through the glass door and screamed because I thought she had just left me. 2 elderly women at a table tried to tell me she would be right back, but I just kept screaming. Story 65. I was about 2.5 years old, riding my bike with my grandma at the park. I fell off, and when I looked at my hands, there was red all over them, and I thought I was bleeding. My grandma came over, calmed me down, and showed me that it was just tiny red berries that had fallen from a nearby bush. I remember feeling so peaceful, loved, and safe with my grandma. Emis here. Story 66. I was 3 years old when we visited my aunt and uncle's house. The first thing I remembered was my cousin showing me his Star Wars toy collection, complete with a Darth Vader helmet carrying case. Story 67. I was almost 4 years old. My dad had a small yellow truck, and we were going down a dirt road that had many bumps, likely a construction site. I found it absolutely hilarious. I remember sliding down the seat a little bit, rolling on my back while I looked up at him, laughing with what I now know were toddler belly laughs. He thought my reaction was funny, and I remember him laughing with me. Eventually, my father changed dramatically due to mental illness. By my early 20s, he had tried to hurt me several times. Once, he actually tried to take my life, but I outran him. By my mid-20s, I had severed my relationship with him. 25 years later, he passed away, never having met my wife or his grandchildren. However, I choose to remember him most strongly up until I was 15, just before he changed. He was a good dad until then, and I honor the memory of his good years by keeping those early years at the forefront of my mind. Story 68. I remember getting my thumb slammed in the door when my older sibling left. I sat in the corner of the kitchen counter while my mom tended to my injury. I was about 3 years old, I think. Story 69. I have a strange memory of the time when I was born. I remember the hospital and my family members. What is most interesting is that I can recall it from a third-person point of view. It could be a self-made memory created by my mind. Story 70. I think I was about 2.5. My cousin took me to school for childcare lessons, something girls had to do in the 1970s along with cooking, while the boys did woodworking. Story 71. It was my 3rd birthday. I said something that I can't remember, and everybody laughed. I thought they were laughing at me, so I cried. My mom tried to help me understand, but when I am embarrassed, there's no helping that. Even now. Story 72. I distinctly remember my mom telling our babysitter that we had a sister on the way. I think I was around 3 years old. I should know the answer to that better. Story 73. About one in a baby cart seeing the tree branches with the sky, I knew that I was on the way to the park. Story 74. I remember sitting in my crib, looking up at some framed artwork in my bedroom. It was a picture of little kids with chubby cheeks, very reminiscent of the 1950s. I remember the rails in the crib. Story 75. I think I was about 1 year old and I couldn't see very far, so I don't really know how old I was, maybe younger. There were 2 photos taken during a shoot. In the first photo, my dad picked me up and said things like, "Ah, my sweet baby girl." But the only thing I could think was, "Ah, that's my dad," or something similar. And then I thought, not the beard. Oh no, not the beard. It hurt. because my dad loved to rub his beard on my head. He wanted me to have thick and abundant hair. I think he got what he wanted, and then I saw a flash of light. It was for a photo. I still have those photos too. In the second photo, I was in a basket filled with stuffed animals. The lady taking photos got annoyed because I kept moving. I wanted a specific toy. My mom told her, "What do you expect? She is a baby. That's what babies do." They were friends, which is why she said that, and my mom got annoyed with her for being mean to me. But that's the earliest I can remember. Story 76. My mother was wheeled into the operating room to have my youngest sister by cesarean section. I was 3 years and 3 months old. My father didn't believe me until I provided a detailed description of the layout of the hospital. For reference, this conversation with my father took place nearly 50 years later. Story 77. Being in an ambulance and eventually an MRI machine when I was 22 months old and had a 105-degree fever, I consider myself very lucky to be alive today. Story 78. The earliest memories I have are from when I was 2 years old. I can remember a lot from that age onwards, but I specifically recall the day I gained consciousness. I was 5 and staring in the mirror. Story 79. We heard a crash outside, and my mom went out to see what had happened. A tile had fallen off the roof. She came back in and told me part of the roof had fallen, and I clearly remember being frightened that the big bad wolf might blow the house down. I can date this precisely to between the ages of 2 months and 10 months because we moved houses frequently. Story 80. One of the earliest memories I have is standing behind a table and looking down at my feet, thinking to myself, I have such small feet. When I grow up, will they be as big as my parents' feet? Story 81. Third birthday party at the lake. My cake had a wind-up plastic train going around a track on top. It was very cloudy. It usually rains on that day. I was 3. Story 82. I have a vague memory of the first house I lived in. We moved out when I was 3 or 4 years old, and I somewhat recall being in the house after most of our belongings were moved out. Story 83. My first memory I can recall is telling my mom she was going the wrong way on my first day of school. She was accidentally taking me to preschool. Story 84. I remember being in a high chair at the age of 2, getting scolded for eating pizza dough. My mom had asked me to help her flatten it out. I have vivid memories of the layout of our home and how my mom looked at that time. When I shared this with her as an adult, she was surprised because she also remembers. She told me I was 2 years old then, and she was amazed that this is my earliest memory. Story 85. I was on the floor in front of the television, and my grandma threw something at me. I assume I was misbehaving, so she was trying to make me stop. Story 86. I think I was a baby. I remember being in one of those large baby car seats with the handle and being placed on the floor in my grandmother's house. It's a truly strange memory to recall so vividly. Story 87. I was probably 6 years old, though I have no memory before that. I returned home from school at the beginning of the school year. Perhaps it was the first day, and I felt very disappointed that I could not read. In fact, the teacher had not taught us how to read. I asked my mom to teach me, and we took my school book where she showed me some words. I remember the first word I ever read, the squirrel. I am now 62 years old. Story 88. I was around 3 years old when we were in a car accident. I remember what happened immediately after and then riding in a wheelchair at the hospital. Story 89. About 2 years ago, a piece of classical music came on the radio and captured my soul. 50 years later, a friend of mine offered me a classical compilation CD set because he couldn't sell it. The second CD had the same track, and I recognized it as soon as the opening bars played. After 50 years of never hearing the tune again, I finally knew the title and the composer. The piece is Elizabethan Serenade by Ronald Binge. Story 90. I have a faint memory of sitting in my crib, looking out the nursery door, through the hallway, into what would eventually become my childhood bedroom. I have no idea how old I was or why that memory has stayed with me. Story 91. Breastfeeding as an infant, I was weaned at 6 months when I was able to eat baby food, and my mom was pregnant with my sister. I remember how my mom smelled and the tickle of her hair on my face when she would burp me over her shoulder. Story 92. I was unsure of my age, sitting in my grandma's arms as she fed me with a baby bottle. I was not enjoying the guests who were coming in. I don't remember seeing them or know who they were. Story 93. I went with my parents to a shop to get my mother's sewing machine repaired. I remember her buying me ice cream later and asking me to say, "Thank you," to the shopkeeper. It's a delightful memory to reflect on. I was around 4 or 5 years old. Story 94. Unsure of my age, but I was still in a crib. I woke up terrified and crying because a thunderstorm had disturbed my sleep. My mom picked me up and placed me in bed with my sisters. My oldest sister said, "Not her. She wets the bed." Story 95. When I told my mother about the memories I had visiting my father in another state, I was surprised to discover that I was only 2 years old. I have many vivid memories from that time. Story 96. When I was about 3 years old, I had a stomach ache, so I lay on the couch for a while before vomiting. My parents still have a picture of a half-conscious baby me covered in pale bile. There are other memories from the same apartment, but I don't know whether they happened before or after this incident. Story 97. 2 years old, I was traveling in a car with my family, looking out the window and listening to a song that I love dearly to this day. Story 98. Playing with the hose in the backyard with my cousins and parents, I saw a ladybug on the ground and cried at the sight of it. I remember my family laughing at me. They told me they went to comfort me in my sadness. Later, I found a recording of that day, and lo and behold, they were laughing at me and told me to just move away from it. I was 4 years old. I have never doubted my memory since. Story 99. Me rocking in my feeding chair, teetering and rapidly approaching the floor. I don't know how old I was. I couldn't use utensils yet. Story 100. I was about 3, maybe pushing 3.5, playing in the doorway of our house when some red ants climbed onto me and bit me. That incident has stuck with me ever since. Story 101. I was 3 or 4, but I distinctly remember my helium-filled balloon flying away and waving goodbye to it. Story 102. 2 or 3 years old, hiding under a table as my parents fought. It was not physical fighting, just yelling and screaming, but still terrifying at that age. Story 103. I was 3 years old. My grandmother had died. My parents left me at my daycare for the funeral. When they picked me up, they gave me a red sled because it was winter. Story 104. I think I was 2 or 3 years old at the time, but I woke up in the middle of the night. When I looked up at the wall, I saw the face of my grandmother surrounded by clouds. She said something to me. I have no idea what now, but then she disappeared and I started crying. My mom rushed in and cradled me, telling me everything was okay. Story 105. I was probably around 6 or 7, making the Little Mermaid birthday invitations with my mom. I had to use the bathroom and experienced severe diarrhea. I called for my mom, saying, "I'm really not feeling well." Story 106. I don't know how I can remember this far back, but I remember being in the hospital room with my parents after my birth. I was sitting in a baby bed next to my mother's hospital bed. I vaguely recall seeing a child training video playing on the TV in the hospital room. After that, the only other thing I remember is playing in the front yard as a child. Story 107. I remember being at a circus during Easter. I saw some lions jump through hoops. Then I got sick and my grandmother and aunt took me out of the tent. Story 108. My 4th birthday. I was 4 years old. I received a large toy truck. The cab was blue and the trailer was gray. You could open the trailer and store several Hot Wheels or similar toys inside. Story 109. My 5th birthday party. I remember playing with a toy that resembled a foam sword. It had a yellow foam cylinder for the blade, and the handle was made of beige plastic in 2 parts that clamped around the foam blade. The game involved a blue shield guard with hinged flaps, each adorned with colored patches. The objective was to stab out all 4 of your opponent's flaps. Story 110. I am 14 now. My very first memory, believe it or not, is when I started clapping and using my hands at about 2 years old. Story 111. On July 27, 1097, my mom locked my dad out of the house while they were arguing. Then, my mom packed us up, and we left. I was 3.5 years old at the time. Story 112. My brother was teasing me. I truly can't remember how old I was. Maybe around 6 or 7. This is legitimately the first memory I have. Story 113. I remember my mom had a friend visiting, and she put me in my crib for bed. I have no idea how old I was, but I believe it was before preschool. Story 114. Eddie Murphy in Harlem Nights. Quick. I haven't been beaten in a while. It's probably been since 1911. Sugar Ray, yes, that's when the doctor slapped you. Quick. Exactly. That's the last time I remember being whipped. I'm looking for him. Story 115. 2.5 years old. We were walking up the stairs in my new house. My mom was holding my hand. The stairs were still bare. Story 116. I was about 10 months old when my mom was changing my diaper. She had just cleaned me and applied baby powder on my bottom. Right when she did, I farted and created a big cloud of baby powder, which made her laugh so much that I laughed with her. A few years ago, I told her that was my first memory, and she laughed, saying she remembers it vividly. Story 117. My third birthday was the first day I was 3 years old. I remember looking at a plastic dancing menorah candle holder that was singing happy birthday to me in Chinese. Story 118. I'm not certain it is the first, but my first family holiday trip, especially the smell of petrol, always comes to mind whenever I encounter that scent, even after all these years. Story 119. My parents were recording a video for a reason I can't recall. My mom wanted me in the video, so to persuade me to stay, she gave me a cookie. However, everything else is just a blur. Another memory that comes to mind is of me walking up the stairs, jumping on my bed, and instantly falling asleep. I then dreamed of a cinematic video featuring the Bullet character from Mario Kart driving down the racetrack. I'm not sure if I was dreaming about an actual cutscene, but it had surprisingly good camera angles for someone who was 3 or 4 years old. Story 120. My mother poured a bowl of Rice Krispies and milk on my head and then placed the bowl on top of my head. I think I was 5. Story 121. I was about 2 years old in a house I didn't live in for very long, chasing a pet cat that didn't like me very much. Story 122. I remember going to the hospital when my sister was born, and my dad telling me we were on our way to meet her. I was a couple of months shy of 3 years old. However, I am not sure if it is a real memory. Story 123. I remember standing in my living room watching my old CRT TV while I could hear my brother shaving in the bathroom. I also recall waiting for my mom to give me my food. Another memory is being in my mother's car with my brother driving while Toxic by Britney Spears played on the radio. I can picture him playing video games on the computer while listening to System of a Down. These memories all remind me of how much I loved being alongside my big brother. Story 124. The beginning and the end. I remember being born and then dying only to be revived again. My mother never believed me until I looked back on it and described the facial features of my doctor, a doctor I had never met or seen in the years that followed. She certainly believed me after that. Story 125. One of my parents propped me up on the couch for a picture of me holding my baby sister in one arm and a bottle in the other. March 2007. I was 2 years and 4 or 5 months old. Story 126. My first traumatic memory is falling into a coffee table and hitting my head when I was about 4 years old. My sister was watching me at the time. A neighbor came over and held a towel to my head until my dad got home, as both parents worked nights. As for good memories, my grandma held me up in the kitchen window so we could watch the fireworks together during a city celebration. I was too young to be downtown. Story 127. When I was 2 or 3 years old, I was walking on the beach with my dad while my other sibling tripped on a toy at the top of the stairs and tumbled all the way down. 16 stairs, which is how high I could count. Story 128. The first time I met my friend, I was 11 years old and had several concussions in a short period of time, which resulted in my inability to recall any full memories from before that. Story 129. Shout out to those with trauma who struggle to remember their childhood. My first memory that isn't influenced by family or friends is from when I was 12 or 13. I was hanging laundry on a clothesline, and there was a pair of striped socks and granny bloomers blowing in the wind. The sky was beautiful, and I felt a peace I've never experienced since. I now have a tattoo of that clothesline. Story 130. I was 3 years old and I couldn't find my pacifier. Apparently, I had thrown it in the trash can, and my parents used the chance to finally get rid of it. I remember wandering around thinking, I just put it here. Story 131. I was born with a hernia, which the doctors couldn't repair until I was 3 years old. Surgery was in 1960, and I remember the anesthesiologist putting the mask over my face and telling me to breathe in. Being 3 years old, I tried to hold my breath. I recall him smiling as he looked down on me, knowing I couldn't hold it for very long. I also remember my aunt and uncle bringing me a colorform set during my hospital stay, and my mom staying in the room with me. Story 132. I was 3 years old. I was watching an episode of a children's television program called Stepping Stones. I remember the theme song and running to find my mom, saying, "Look, that's my number." Story 133. I was in preschool, and I looked up at the sky to see the most beautiful view I had ever seen. The clouds were orange, tipped with sunlight against a bright blue background, and they surrounded the sun in a way that felt ethereal. I thought it was so genuinely beautiful that it awakened my mind, making me think, wow, this view is an incredible feast for the eyes, in a 4-year-old way. From that moment, I began to remember certain things vividly, as if they had happened yesterday. The view truly shocked my mind into heightened awareness. Story 134. In preschool, my brother and I tried to ride a 2-seater bike as young children who did not know how to ride bikes. Story 135. I must have been about 1 year old. We were in the front room of a house we moved out of a few months later when my dad put a record on the turntable. I remember it was a Chrysalis record because I pointed at the butterfly. I am guessing it was Huey Lewis and the News album Sports, since my dad noted in my baby book that it was my favorite record as a baby. I think he would play it to help calm me down. Story 136. I think I was 2 or 3 years old. I was lying on the floor in front of my house in the sunlight. Story 137. Adlerian psychologists have conducted in-depth research on earliest recollections. Your earliest recollection can influence aspects such as your choice of occupation and the person you marry. Story 138. I think I was about 2 years old. It's surprising I can remember this far back. I was in a crib with some sort of baby toy above me. Story 139. Lying down in my crib, I felt disappointed that it was not, in fact, a bakery, as I had just woken up from a truly delicious dream. Story 140. I have vague memories of a vacation in Florida when I was 2, a couple of months before my 3rd birthday. Story 141. Being carried into Walmart in my baby carrier. I was 5 months old. This was a few months before they changed to their 2008 logo, which is why I stylized it as Walmart and not Walmart. Story 142. Sitting on my grandfather's lap while he played the piano. I was about 20 months old, according to my mother. Story 143. May 5th. Looking out the window of my bedroom at the sun, either rising or setting, feels surreal when I think about it. That was over 42 years ago. Story 144. I was 4 years old in kindergarten when a handyman working near our playhouse hit his head on a sharp corner. There was blood everywhere. I remember panicking and running to get help. The ambulance arrived quickly. Before they took him away, he knelt down, gave me a hug, and said thank you. Kevin, if you're out there, I still remember you. Story 145. Watching a record spin on the record player while staring at the album cover of Night Flight to Venus by Boney M. I must have been 2 or 3 years old and loved watching it spin and listening to the songs. Story 146. 3 years old in a gas station parking lot, freezing in a onesie. I don't know why it's so heavy in my head. Story 147. I remember stepping on a stool to open the silverware drawer to look for my Mickey Mouse spoon. I was not pleased when it wasn't in there. My parents confirmed the story later in life. Story 148. Not sure if it was a scene from The Lord of the Rings or the original Star Wars saga. I was probably around 3 years old. Story 149. At 2 years old, I remember pretending I was Meowth, scratching my uncle's face as he picked me up. He passed away shortly after my 3rd birthday, but he was a core member of my family's life. This is the only memory I have of him, and I cherish it for that reason. Story 150. A 3-year-old me applying almost a whole container of lotion all over my body, even on top of my clothes. Story 151. I can remember being in a stroller. The actual memories of what happened are too vague, but I can distinctly recall what the stroller was like and its shape around me. Story 152. I was 3 years old, sitting by my bedroom door, shoving a penny into my mouth and spitting it back out over and over again until I accidentally swallowed it. My next memory is being taken away from my parents in the hospital and being put to sleep. Story 153. I was crying so hard, next to my brother on my left, looking out the window because my dad had just left the house, and my parents had separated. I was 3. My brother was 7. We were both very upset, and my mom must have been distraught, trying to keep us from crying even harder while dealing with the divorce. This is certainly not the best memory, though it might not even be the worst. Story 154. I was bathed in my grandma's sink and played with the cat. I told my mom this, and she said I was 18 months old at the time. I remember that the cat seemed massive to me, and I could only crawl after it. Story 155. I would hide under my bed and watch the feet pass. I didn't want to come out. When I was about 1.5 years old, my brother died and was buried. I didn't want to die or be buried. That was my memory and fear. Story 156. My mom was slammed to the floor by my little brother's dad. Then we locked ourselves in the bedroom and climbed out the bathroom window, with me handing my infant brother out first. On the other side of the trailer, my older brother climbed out of his bedroom window with a box of his kittens. I was 6 years old, and my brothers were 6 months and 14 years old. Story 157. I remember running after my mother as she left for police training. It was residential, and I was probably 2. I had a long, off-white, knotted piece of a blanket that I particularly favored trailing behind me. I loved my mother so much and didn't want her to leave. My dad was pretty violent, and I was afraid to be left with him. Story 158. A child kicked over my sandcastle when we lived in Italy. I must have been about 3 or 4 years old. I don't remember much else. The Colosseum? No. The Vatican? No. Literally being inside Mount Vesuvius? No. A naked child? Yes. Sigh. Story 159. One of my first memories was when I was about 4, almost 5. I watched the planes hit the towers on television. It was a shocking way to become aware of my own consciousness. Luckily, I didn't fully understand what I was witnessing. Story 160. I was 2.5 years old, according to my mom. I had chicken pox, and I remember being in a playpen while my mom handed me a coloring book and a box of crayons. Story 161. I was 3 years old when my preschool teachers became concerned, and my parents came to pick me up early. I held onto this memory for a long time before realizing that I was recalling the events of September 11th from a toddler's perspective. I was nowhere near New York City, but still in America. Story 162. I don't remember how old I was, but my first word was apple, and I recall the moment I said it to my mom. We were at my grandmother's house, and my mom was sitting with a few of my older cousins in the dining area. There was a line of plastic fruit hanging from the doorway, and the bottom one was an apple. I pointed at it and said, "Apple." Everyone approved. Then I pointed at the next fruit in the line, a pear or something, and said, "Apple" again. This time, I remember negative responses. At that moment, I thought, what do you want? It's the only word I know, but I was happy overall. I told my mother about this when I was in my late 20s, and she confirmed the memory. Story 163. I don't remember how old I was, but my first word was apple, and I recall the moment I said it to my mom. We were at my grandmother's house, and my mom was sitting with a few of my older cousins in the dining area. There was a line of plastic fruit hanging from the doorway, and the bottom one was an apple. I pointed at it and said, "Apple." Everyone approved. Then I pointed at the next fruit in the line, a pear or something, and said, "Apple" again. This time I received negative responses. I remember thinking, what do you want? It's the only word I know, but I was happy overall. I told my mother about this when I was in my late 20s, and she confirmed the memory. Story 164. I don't remember how old I was, but my first word was apple. And I remember the moment I said it to my mom. We were at my grandmother's house, and my mom was sitting with a few of my older cousins in the dining area. There was a line of plastic fruit hanging from the doorway, and the bottom one was an apple. I pointed at it and said, "Apple." Everyone approved. Then I pointed at the next fruit on the line, a pear or something, and said, "Apple" again. This time I remember getting negative responses. At the time I thought, what do you want? It's the only word I know, but I was happy overall. I told my mother about this when I was in my late 20s, and she confirmed the memory. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.